Hello, my name is Dr. Bettina Shea, and I'm an assistant professor at California State University, Long Beach in the Teacher Education Department. This is a two-part short video series adapted from a talk I gave at Fullerton College in May 2014 entitled The Common Core Goes to College. In this first video, I'll be discussing the three fundamental shifts in English language arts and math that have taken place with the adoption of the Common Core state standards. And in the second video, I'll discuss the impact of some of these changes on secondary schools and their implications for community colleges. There are several fundamental shifts in the Common Core standards themselves from the former set of content standards. I'm going to go over these shifts, starting with the fundamental differences between the two types of standards. Prior to the Common Core in California, No Child Left Behind legislation was based on performance on the California Standards Test and California High School Exit Exam, both of which are standardized tests aligned with the 1999 California Content Standards. The California Content Standards determined specific knowledge at each grade level that students should have mastery of. There was little focus on process or reasoning. In these standards, facts and knowledge were privileged, and the content standards were done on a state-by-state basis. In contrast to the knowledge-based standards we've been operating under, the Common Core, along with its science and social studies companions listed here, emphasizes specific skills, principles, also sometimes referred to as disciplinary habits of mind, and practices. The Common Core is a national set of standards designed to help us to compare apples to apples, both across the United States and around the world. These practices, skills, and principles are applied to content, a percentage of which is left up to each specific state. Because the Common Core is more about reasoning and practices needed to be successful in English language arts, literacy, and math, there is much more equal emphasis placed on thinking, process, and the skills necessary to be successful, as there is on obtaining the right answer. Now that we've discussed the general shift in the standards, we can look at more specific shifts to K-12 instruction to help us consider the change at the community college level. We'll start first in relation to English language arts and literacy. I'd like to note here that the fact that the Common Core expressly addresses both English language arts and literacy in history, science, and technical subjects is an important indicator of something that English content language specialists have been saying for years. The job of teaching reading, writing, and language development should not be the sole role of the English teacher. While it is an important part of an English teacher or professor's role, all instructors also must be attentive to what making meaning from text and explaining one's thinking in oral and written form means in their particular content areas. English teachers do not necessarily have the domain-specific sense of what informs literacy development outside of their content areas. And as the first shift indicates, students will be expected in K-12 classrooms to have regular practices with complex text and their academic language. Briefly, this means that students will progressively develop their reading skills in grades K through 12, establishing foundational literacy skills at the K through 5 level, then developing more nuanced reading skills, including subject-specific reading strategies through the practice of close reading of increasingly complex texts over time. Students will need to have more independent vocabulary-based strategies, including finding meanings in context through close reading and using resources to determine vocabulary meaning in context. They will also need exposure to both Tier 2 general academic vocabulary and Tier 3 content-specific terms in order to be successful in the Common Core-based classroom. The development of these reading skills, including vocabulary, would be scaffolded or supported through classroom-based instruction. So the Common Core isn't just about assigning text for independent practice, but apprenticing students in developing these skills through explicit exposure to these complex texts. The second major shift in terms of ELA literacy that the Common Core emphasizes is the importance of evidence. Reading, writing, and speaking in the Common Core state standards should be grounded in evidence from text, both literary and informational. This means that we should be asking students text-based and text-dependent questions, questions that require them to look carefully for evidence in the text, not stopping and making personal connections to text thematically. This does not mean that there is no longer a place for personal connection to text, as personal connection to text can affect reader motivation and engagement. But the Common Core does emphasize that connection to text and close reading cannot stop at the personal level. Rather, questioning should require students to use and cite specific evidence that supports their claims. That will then lead to evidence-based argumentation in writing and speaking. When students make a claim, whether it is based on theme and characterization in a literary text or a claim related to historical perspective or scientific finding, they must cite evidence that, by the secondary level, comes from a variety of sources, including media and print-based text. This is a shift from a focus on persuasion or response to literature as separate genres at the K-12 level to a more cross-content focus on the importance of using evidence to support an argument. Finally, the third major shift in the Common Core English Language Arts literacy standards is the explicit focus on building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. Now, this is not to say that the previous content standards did not incorporate nonfiction or expository text, but under the Common Core state standards, there's an explicit shift of focus from mainly literary text to an emphasis on nonfiction text from a variety of subject areas. By the 12th grade, students are expected to do 30% of their reading in literature and 70% in nonfiction text. Now, there is a common misconception that this shift means that literature will no longer be read in classrooms, but this is not actually true. Literacy will remain the core work of secondary English teachers. However, literary nonfiction and literacy in history, science, and the technical subjects, as well as English, should be used to build content-rich knowledge. I often explain it to teachers this way. If 30% of all texts being read by high school seniors should be literary, it's safe to assume that these texts will fall under the domain of the English teacher. If we divide the remaining 70% by 3, then this averages to about 23% of expository text being read in each content area. In other words, this is about a 60-40 split of literary versus expository text used specifically in the English content area, with 40% expository text, as mentioned earlier, possibly being texts that give important background knowledge or exposure to genres that support literary understanding. So now we'll turn from English language arts literacy to mathematics, and it's important to remember that even though these shifts are content specific, they also reflect the perspectives behind the standards themselves. So even if you're not a math person, hopefully you'll be able to connect with some of these changes. The first shift in mathematics is a greater focus on fewer topics. This means the development of sound foundational skills in early mathematics, particularly in grades K through 8. These foundational skills will then support the deep understandings, procedural fluency, and increasing sophistication of applications of problem-solving skills. Poor foundational math skills, particularly beginning with difficulty in fluency with multiplication and basic operations using fractions, when combined with traditional focus on algorithms or plugging into equations rather than using number sense, mathematical thinking, and problem solving, really prevent students from later mathematical competency. The shift away from covering many discrete skills in a single course towards more deeply covering a few topics should help more students gain mastery and fluency in mathematical thinking. The second key shift in mathematics is the idea of coherence, or linking topics and thinking across grade levels. Traditionally, the way we've organized mathematics, particularly once students reach secondary level, is in a discrete progression. Pre-algebra, algebra, geometry, algebra 2 trigonometry, pre-calculus or math analysis, and calculus. The discrete titles of these courses and their separate standards imply discrete learning rather than the connection of math concepts over time. Under the new Common Core state standards, each year builds upon and extends previous learning from prior years with a coherent progression from year to year. The distinction will be particularly important to both counselors and administrators trying to determine equivalencies, as well as math instructors, because while some secondary schools may choose to keep the traditional titles of these courses, which is one option under the Common Core, the actual standards covered in these courses are dramatically different than under the prior content standards. Some high schools are transitioning from these former course titles to an integrated mathematics curriculum that mirrors the way that mathematics is taught nearly universally in the international community outside of the US. Integrated mathematics aligns well with the shift towards coherence, but represents a huge instructional shift for teachers at the secondary level. The final key shift in mathematics is an emphasis in rigor that privileges conceptual understanding, procedural skills and fluency, and application with equal intensity. Conceptual understanding requires students to move beyond algorithms to really understand how and why mathematical concepts work. Students must be able to access concepts from a number of perspectives in order to see math as more than a set of mnemonics or discrete procedures. In relation to procedural skills and fluency, the standards call for speed and accuracy in calculation. Students must practice core functions, such as single-digit multiplication, in order to have access to more complex concepts and procedures. Fluency must be addressed in the classroom or through supporting materials, as some students may require more practice than others. And finally, in terms of application, the standards call for students to use math in situations that require mathematical knowledge. Correctly applying mathematical knowledge depends on students having a solid conceptual understanding and procedural fluency. We'll see some clear applications in a few moments when we look at some of the assessments, but for now, I'll end this video here and we'll proceed to part 2, which discusses the implication of the changes in standards to secondary classrooms and the implications for community college settings.